the idea that you can just sort of sit back and wait for a Section 30 to be granted, there's no reasonable precedent in terms of the history of the United Kingdom governments and how they've dealt with independence movements. I mean, you have to campaign for it, you have to articulate it, you have to pressure for it, you have to use the political means at your disposal to make it a question that can't be refused.
And I think the idea that the biggest priority for the country is to have another referendum is just for the birds.
6 minutes past 9. So the last time there was a referendum on Scottish independence in 2014, Alex Salmond was the leader of the SNP and at the front of the campaign to leave the UK. He now leads a different party, Alba. Let's get his reflections on the plan by Nicola Sturgeon to have another referendum. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Have you got the date in your diary? October the 19th, 2023?
Well, certainly the date's in the diary, and I'm hoping that'll be the date of the next referendum for Scottish independence. But I think there's a fair amount of water to go under the bridge before then. But most people, including myself and the national movement in Scotland, are just pleased that at last there's some initiative from the Scottish government to implement the mandates they've been given by the Scottish people.
What do you think about the route that Nicola Sturgeon is taking then, which is to go to the Supreme Court first, see what they say? If they say no, then this idea of campaigning on the single issue of Scottish independence at the next general election?
Well, I mean, let's take things in turn. I mean, the first step that Nicola Sturgeon's making is she's asking for the Section 30 from Boris Johnson. She wrote to him yesterday. Now, that's certainly the right thing to do, because that would short-circuit a lot of other political discussion. Now, my interest and quarrel with this is that you can't just sit back and ask Boris Johnson to give you a polite reply at some point. I mean, if you're going to have a Section 30, you have to campaign for it. You have to put political pressure on. And I'm talking about popular demonstration in Scotland, parliamentary interventions at Westminster, where the SNP has a powerful hand of over 40 MPs, and also diplomatic action internationally. I mean, the UK government shouldn't be allowed just to slide over the fact that they are refusing to respect the democratic wishes of the Scottish people, who've now voted 4 times to have another independence referendum. So that's step one. Step two in the Supreme Court, I mean, I think that's a bit of a Hail Mary step, to be absolutely frank. I don't think you can leave the issue of Scottish sovereignty into the tender mercies of the UK Supreme Court, and there's very little indication and very little hope that they'll give you a favourable judgment. Step 3, that is using the UK general elections as a plebiscite, is a perfectly legitimate political move. You have to think through the consequences of a plebiscite election, in which case you can't just fight it as a single political party. You've got to fight it as a national movement, with one candidate for independence in each seat.
What about the substantive issues around independence? Obviously, things have changed now with Brexit. There's membership of the EU, whether that can be guaranteed. There's still the issue of currency. And then, of course, about a hard border. Currency was an issue last time around. It kind of hasn't gone away. But on those 3 points, there aren't really any cast iron guarantees at this stage, are there?
Well, you're quite right to bring these points up, because these are some of the fundamental changes in the world that we've had since 2014. I mean, there's other changes as well. I mean, we've got a war in Europe. There's a pandemic that we've all experienced, an unprecedented tragedy for many families. So things have happened in the world since 2014, and therefore the case for independence has to be updated to take account of these. I'm not at all pessimistic about that. I mean, you can't just say, look, we're back in the world where the rest of the UK and Scotland would have been members of the European Union. But Brexit has happened. It is a fact. And therefore, you have to adjust the case for independence to take account of the modern reality. Now, for example, let's take probably the biggest change in terms of impacting on independence, the case of Europe. Now, it's quite reasonable, because most people in Scotland, 2/3, voted to stay in the European Union, for that to be the aim of the SNP government. But you can't pretend that you can get back into the European Union in 6 months. I mean, it's a 5-year process. Therefore, you have to have a policy, particularly if you're thinking of independence negotiations, it's fit for for a timescale of negotiations. Now, luckily, there is such a policy, and that is you can join the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, the four-country association, not in 5 years. You can join it in a few months. And if you join EFTA, then you inherit all EFTA's trade deals with the European Union and indeed with the United Kingdom and the rest of the world. And that would put you in a strong and stable negotiating position to negotiate independence. Then, of course, the issue of European Union membership could be dealt with by the people of an independent Scotland in a reasonable timescale. In other words, you secure the economics and let the politics take care of itself. Okay. So that's why you certainly, myself and others have put forward, and the Alpha Party put forward the policy of EFTA membership, either as a transitional stage to European Union membership in the future, or indeed the end destination. I mean, EFTA is not a bad place to be. I mean, the four countries in EFTA at the present moment, that's Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, are among the top four countries in the world in terms of wealth per head. So it's not a bad anchorage to have for an independent Scotland, at least for the negotiating period. But your point is well taken. You have to update the case for independence to meet the realities of the modern world.
I still remember when I was covering the independence referendum, and when the yes side lost, you obviously stood down. You said that the dream had died. The dream seems to be very much alive still for several people, including yourself. If Nicola Sturgeon were to lose this referendum, do you think that she would have to stand down?
Well, I actually said the dream shall never die. In fact, I wrote a book entitled The Dream Shall Never Die, because I knew that the case and cause of independence wasn't going away and would come back. And I said then that it's going to come back not because of any individual politician, but because of the socially aware and politically activated base of people in Scotland who are campaigning for independence. It was the people who've made independence come back by voting for it. Now, the last thing I would do if I were Nicola Sturgeon is to anticipate defeat in a referendum. So I'm not going to speculate on what happens if she loses. But I'm perfectly happy to talk about what happens if we achieve a referendum.
Well, that was my next question. Would you work with, who would you be working then with Nicola Sturgeon, with the SNP?
Yes, I mean, that's not a difficulty at all. I mean, the whole national movement will unite behind the cause of independence if we achieve the referendum. But we have to think through. I mean, I think my main issue presently is the idea that you can just sort of sit back and wait for a Section 30 to be granted. There's no reasonable precedent in terms of the history of the United Kingdom governments and how they've dealt with independence movements. I mean, you have to campaign for it, you have to articulate it, you have to pressure for it, you have to use the political means at your disposal to make it a question that can't be refused. Now, the hand that the Scottish Government has is not a weakness. I mean, the weakness is in Downing Street.
So why then do you think that Nicola Sturgeon doesn't seem to have the appetite for that particular fight and wants to do it through other channels? Well,
hopefully yesterday's announcement was an indication that the fight is on, that the starting gun has been fired. I mean, there was no starting gun fired before yesterday, and the first step in that starting gun is she's requested the Section 30. So presumably now, which will happen, is a campaign to force Boris Johnson's hand. I was going to say that, look, compared to David Cameron and George Osborne, who I didn't agree with, but I mean, they were political giants in comparison to Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. I mean, we're not talking about a strong prime minister here. We're talking about somebody who a puff of wind would probably blow over. So I wouldn't discount if the energy and campaign is there, the ability to force Boris Johnson's hand into an agreed referendum, which would obviate all the necessity for court actions or for using the next general election as an independence plebiscite.
We will see what happens. Alex Salmond, thank you very much. Very interesting. That is Alex Salmond, who is the leader of the Alba Party.
8:44, the SNP want a referendum on independence next year. Nicola Sturgeon has now asked the Supreme Court to look into whether Scotland could legally do so. Lisa Nandy is Labour's Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. We can speak to her now. Good morning to you.
Hello, good morning.
Are there any circumstances in which you would support another referendum for independence in Scotland?
Well, it's a question of never say never, but it was Nicola Sturgeon in the SNP who said that the last referendum was a once in a generation chance to settle the question. And there are 700,000 people currently on NHS waiting lists in Scotland. There are real challenges facing the people of Scotland. And I think the idea that the biggest priority for the country is to have another referendum is just for the birds. It's really important that we have a government, not just in Holyrood, but in Westminster as well, that starts focusing on the very real challenges facing families up and down Scotland, and starting with the National Health Service and the treatment times and the waiting times, I would suggest would be a good priority for the SNP government, rather than focusing on trying to keep their own jobs and kickstarting their re-election campaign.
You say never, but what would change, do you think? Say that the Supreme Court lets them have a consultative referendum and there's a big majority for yes. Would that change your view? Say the Supreme Court says no, but there's a general election and the SNP do very, very well. What point could your view be changed on the need to have one?
Well, at the moment, the polls show that most people in Scotland are very concerned about the challenges that they have, not just NHS waiting times, but falling school standards and opportunities for young people, the same sort of things that are affecting families up and down the United Kingdom, and that we desperately need not just the SNP to get a grip of, but the UK government and Boris Johnson as well. I think these have to be the priorities for any responsible political leader at the moment. The country can't go on like this. We've got to get growth back into the economy. We've got to get money back into people's pockets, and we've got to get our public services working. I'm sitting here in Harrogate at the moment with local government leaders, Conservative leaders, Labour leaders, Liberal Democrat leaders from across the country, all of whom are warning that without a more proactive approach from government, working with frontline workers as partners rather than treating them as enemies, as we've seen in the last few weeks, then vital public services, not just rail, but social care and other public services are going to fall over. So we all need to come together at the moment, stop pitting ourselves against one another, stop dividing us from each other, and pull together in order to get through what is a huge crisis facing this country.
In a general election campaign, which could be sooner than we think, we might get to that in a moment, Nicola Sturgeon will fight it on the grounds there should be a Scottish independence. The question that will be asked of Labour, therefore, will there ever be any agreement between Labour and SNP? If you vote Labour, are you effectively backing the SNP to any extent? Can you confirm, have you thought about this? Would you ever have any form of electoral pact with the SNP in the future?
No, we wouldn't. We wouldn't do a deal going into an election. We wouldn't do a deal going out of an election. We don't believe in independence. We think that the UK is stronger together. And the challenge that we have is to show that by making the United Kingdom work for everybody, that we can improve outcomes for people in Scotland, including those who supported independence last time. At the moment, people in Scotland have got a double challenge. They've got the SNP in Holyrood, and they've got the Boris Johnson in Westminster. But with Labour back as a serious party, fighting the Tories off into second place in Scotland and seeing a bounce in the opinion polls in the UK as a whole, there is a real prospect that people in Scotland could get the governance that they deserve, and we could start focusing on things like bringing those waiting times down in the National Health Service and investing in our young people, which is precisely what we're setting out this week, and why I'm here in Harrogate with local government leaders to say to them that we can level up this country, we can get the economy growing, and we can have a better Britain than the one that is currently on offer.
There's a story in the Times today that the CCHQ, the Conservative Party HQ, is preparing for a snap election if Starmer is forced to resign because he gets fined by Durham police. The Tory party are getting ready for a snap election. Would you be ready if there was a snap election?
I think the Tory party should just start focusing on doing their actual jobs. There are people in this country who just can't keep their heads above water. They don't know how they're going to get through the weekend because of record inflation and a government that has been sitting on its hands while all of this has been unfolding. The only decisive thing that they've done is to raise taxes on working people, the only major economy to do that in the middle of a global inflation crisis. I'm not preparing for a snap election. I am spending every waking hour trying to work out how we square a circle where we've got lots of frontline workers who have been underpaid for a decade, who look after our own families and can't afford to feed their own at the moment. We've got record shortages in many of our frontline public sector work. We've got problems in schools, problems in hospitals, problems in social care. And I'm here in Harrogate with local government leaders who are grappling with that in real time. We need a government that stops focusing on how to save their own jobs and actually start doing it in the interests of the country.
Just finally, and very quickly before you go, Lisa Nandy, any Tories spoken to you about defection? Anyone on the wobble you've spoken to? You don't have to give a name, but have you actually spoken to anyone?
Not about defecting to Labour, but, obviously there's a lot of disquiet in the Conservative Party and privately behind closed doors. I think most Conservatives are open about that. The problem for the country is that the debate that they seem to be having is more about what is in the Conservative Party's interests, whether they should junk Boris Johnson and try an alternative in the interests of Tory electoral prospects, not a conversation about what is in the interests of the country. There are a few decent exceptions to that and, more power to their elbow. But if Conservative MPs have had one message for them today, it's start focusing on the interests of the country, because in case they hadn't noticed, there is a crisis going on for most families and most businesses now, and we need an active, enabling government to step forward and start trying to sort that out.
Lisa Nandy, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
That's Lisa Nandy, Labour's Shadow Levelling Up Secretary.
8:50, breakfast on Times Radio with Asma Mir and Stig Abel.